Hi, I'm Stuart and welcome back to Shure's Whiteboard sessions. Today we're going to be looking at antenna selection and placement. Like microphones, antennas are transducers, converting energy from one form to another. So in the case of transmitting antennas for in-ear monitoring systems, we're converting current into electromagnetic waves. And for your wireless microphone systems, we're doing the reverse. We're taking those electromagnetic waves and converting them into current. The size of an antenna is related to its wavelength. So for VHF systems from say 170 to 216 megahertz, you're looking at a wavelength of approximately 1.5 meters. But in the UHF range from 470 to 790 megahertz, say, the wavelength shrinks right down to maybe about half a meter. Design of antennas also determines the performance. So depending on the actual design, you can add features like directionality, increased forward gain, and limit the bandwidth of those antennas. So the two types of antennas we generally use with our wireless microphone systems and in-ear monitoring systems are either omnidirectional or directional. So omnidirectional antennas are typically either quarter or half wave. So what we mean by that is if the wavelength of UHF is half a meter, then a half wave antenna would be 25 to 30 centimeters long. Take for example this half wave antenna. Another characteristic of omnidirectionals is that they are vertically polarized. So that means they receive in this orientation. So if you were to point these directly at your transmitters, you would lose performance in the system because you're aiming a null point at your transmitters. And lastly, they have uniform sensitivity. So it doesn't matter whether your transmitters are being received from this orientation or either side or the rear, they will pick up the same amount with an omnidirectional antenna. Some characteristics of directional antennas are you have increased on-axis sensitivity. So if this is our say, UA874 paddle antenna, you will get increased forward gain in this orientation. So this is useful in either harsh RF environments where the noise floor isn't ideal and you just need to kind of block out some of that noise and get the directionality you need towards your transmitters, or it's also beneficial if you need some additional range from your system, because again you can cut out that noise and just focus on the transmission that you need to receive. Another common question that we receive, particularly with these paddle antennas, is active versus passive. We always feel and hear that active antennas are better. You get more RF received at your receivers. Now, it really all depends on the application, because with active antennas, you're boosting the amount of signal that is received at your receivers, but you're also bringing in a bit of extra noise into the system as well. And generally, the amplifiers on the antennas are really only there to compensate for losses within the cable rather than increasing the forward gain of the system. So the benefits you're getting from those is you're compensating for those cable losses. So when it comes to placing your antennas, there's a few things that you need to keep in mind. One of those things is separation between your receiving antennas. In order to maintain diversity performance, you want to keep a minimum of about a quarter wavelength spacing between those. But ideally, if you can get them about a wavelength apart, then you will have strong performance from your system. If you get those antennas too close, then you run the risk of things like multipath interference causing dropouts. And if you separate them too far, then the system essentially views them as two separate antennas, so you lose the benefit of diversity. Another thing to consider is your transmission to receiving antenna distance. You want to keep about 3 meters as a minimum from your transmitter to receivers, just so that you don't get things like RF overload and overload your receivers. Two things antennas and RF really dislike are metal, so things like metal mesh fences or cages. that essentially just blocks the RF from coming straight through to your receiving antennas, and water. And as people, we are largely made up of water. So when you're running your events, you want to try and get your antennas up nice and high, clear the heads of the people that are attending, and stop them from absorbing all that RF from reaching your antennas. You also want to avoid sources of interference. So one thing we kind of advise against is mixing both wireless transmitters and receiving antennas in the same racks, because if you have an in-ear monitoring system and a wireless mic system in the same rack, the transmitting antenna for your in-ear monitors is going to be outputting a lot more power and will desensitize the receiving antennas of your wireless racks. Another thing is, if you're using multiple receivers in a given rack, then it's always a good idea to remote those antennas so that you can get them up nice and high and get some good line of sight to your transmitters. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Shure Whiteboard Sessions. If you'd like to know more about wireless microphones or in-ear monitoring systems, then we do host our wireless mastered seminars here at Shure UK. And to make sure you don't miss any more episodes in the series, then please subscribe at losingyourvoice.co.uk. So when it come in so with an Omni antenna